Good morning. It's the last edition of Business Morning for the week. Thank you for joining us. I'm Chimize Obi Iwago. Starting with global oil market update. Prices rose this morning, recovering further ground after touching three-week lows in the previous session, hit by a record decline in U.S. growth as the coronavirus ravaged the world's biggest economy and oil consumer. Brent crude was up by 40 cents at $43.34 a barrel. On Thursday, Brent closed down 1.9%, but had recovered much of the ground lost from the lowest level since July 10. U.S. crude gained 35 cents to $40.27 after dropping 3.3% the previous session, again recovering from lows not seen since July 10. That leaves Brent on track for a fourth month of gains, while U.S. crude is heading for a third consecutive month of increases as the contracts have recovered from the depths reached in April when much of the world was in lockdown. But as a second wave of infections rages around the world, the threat to oil demand is becoming apparent. OPEC Plus, a grouping of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries and its allies, collectively plan to increase production from Saturday, adding about 1.5 million barrels per day to global supply. Globally, the economic outlook has dimmed again, with increasing coronavirus infections raising the risk of renewed lockdowns and threatening any rebound. That was underlined by Thursday's news that U.S. gross domestic product collapsed at 32.9% annualized rate, the deepest decline in output since records began in 1947. And the International Monetary Fund has launched a new central bank transparency code for all member countries as it seeks to address issues of accountability and governance that will arise due to the unconventional interventions during the COVID-19 pandemic. The fund explains that the new CBT will allow central banks to measure transparency in 5 key areas of governance so as to maintain public support, safeguard independence, and enhance policy effectiveness. It adds that due to the impact of the pandemic on economies, the central banks need to increase trust and support between various stakeholders. Since the pandemic started early this year, central banks have been adopting several policies to save their economies from severe recession, including taking up supervisory roles and other financial stability functions with broader stakeholder engagements. According to the IMF, the CBT will be applicable on a voluntary basis by all member countries, including less developed economies. All right, the federal government lately seems to have turned its attention to the youths with a number of initiatives put in place to develop the Nigerian youth and create jobs. One of such initiatives is the 75 Billionaire Youth Investment Fund being proposed by the Minister of Youth and Sports Development. And don't forget, the federal government recently handed over the National Theatre to the Central Bank and Bankers Committee to revitalize the creative industry and perhaps create 1 million jobs. In all of these initiatives, ICT is set to be one area to give attention to. Well, joining me now to talk more about this is the president of the Institute of Software Practitioners of Nigeria, Dr. Yele Okeremi. Thank you very much, Dr. Okeremi, for joining us on the program.
Always a pleasure, Jose.
Well, there have been a number of initiatives by government to get the youths employed in the IT field. What do you make of all of these initiative?
Well, I think, first of all, it's always a good thing when there are attempts to create jobs in economies. But I think it's more important to look at a specific strategy nationally to achieving this. So, for example, you've given 2 initiatives, one by the Ministry of Youth, which is good, youth and sport, and then the other one by the Central Bank and the Bankers Committee,
having to transform the National Theatre into a kind of a creative hub.
Yes, that makes sense. However, what I noticed with that particular move is
which of them now? This
the one by the Bankers Committee, yes, is that it's in itself a smart thing. But I realized that you want to introduce IT into it. And of course, if you understand the meaning of IT today, IT permits everything. It's part of our lives. And it's different from the way it used to be, where IT used to be merely business support tools. Today, technology trumps everything. However, I see that the way that transaction is being packaged may need a little rejigging. Because IT, while it is true that it is also creative, but IT is not exactly creative art. And
so it shouldn't fall into those categories.
Yeah, we need to understand that it's a specialized category. Because, so you talk about creative art, which is smart in its own self. But technology, IT, just like the name is both science and art. So there's a creative part of IT, which is like what you see in creative art. But there's a whole lot of science in it.
No, I'm sure when they talk about creativity, perhaps they are looking at people like you or startups, maybe in your area, that develop those softwares that are used.
Yes, and that's correct. And there's a whole lot of attention to startups as well, and there's a whole lot of attention to technology. But one of the things I have said consistently, and I think I've said it on this platform before, is, see, if you want to do technology, you need a national strategy around it. So I can give you some examples.
Please do.
So, for example, when you talk about people creating apps, because there's a whole lot, just like you said, a lot of attention to startups. And I hear people even using languages like a startup ecosystem. And that's interesting when I hear that kind of thing. Because you see, we do not talk about startup ecosystems, ordinarily speaking. Because if you understand the meaning of an ecosystem in itself, an ecosystem, well, that comes from biology, but it can also be used. It talks about interactions between several parties. The issues about talking about startups is that, first of all, startups are not new.
So how do you describe these ecosystems, particularly when it concerns the startups?
Yes, I'm coming there. So startups need to be seen within the ambits of a bigger ecosystem. Because if you have startups and you do not know where they will end up, you are running into crisis. So for you to have a viable startup system, you need to have a situation that allows them to scale, that allows them to become significant. Because what happens in startups is simple biology. Nature is not very good at creating cream. So what happens is that you're going to have so many startups. So it's a funneling system. You have so many companies who are starting up great, brilliant ideas. But perhaps only 8% may survive. So there's a whole lot of risk coming in there. So you need to have a system that actually guarantees or de-risks the system. And the way to do that, ordinarily speaking, we don't need to start building from the roof. We need to build from the foundation. So the way to do this, to de-risk the system and to guarantee and assure ourselves that startups can actually become significant, is to look at incumbent players in the industry. I've maintained this position for several years. What you need to do is look at some major players, ensure that we can create enterprises in the field that have scale, that can compete globally. And we don't even need to worry ourselves too much in trying to compete globally. We can start by simply doing import substitution. Just look at where the money is going. And that's why the initiative of the Bankers Committee, I find to be very interesting, I like. However, it needs to my mind, I think it needs to be rejigged. Because if you look at how much we spend as a country on finance, the financial industry, I think it's significant in terms of technology spendings. But the question is, we are spending so much, how much is retained within the country? And how much could have been retained within the country? So I think we need to take a look at that.
That brings to question indigenous participation, perhaps.
Absolutely,
where you're
yes.
driving at.
Absolutely, yes.
So how much of these indigenous, this is a sector where you operate and you've operated in this sector for several years. Are you saying we don't have, do we really have qualified, we talked about skills.
Yes.
Do we have that skill to really be very competitive when it comes to IT?
Look, unequivocally, yes. And I can say that, you see, the issues about life, everything about life depends on narratives. What do we say When we came into the studio this morning, I just dragged the chair and sat down. You sat on the chair. No questions asked. Why did you sit on the chair? What if before we came into the studio, this type of chairs we are sitting on, they put 3 of them outside with broken legs? And just somebody standing outside the studio was talking about, oh, yesterday when some guest came, the chair collapsed. You and I would not be sitting down on the chair right now. And if we sat on the chair, once there's a little crack, we will be very fidgety. The question is, what do we say? When you talk about the sights and sounds of countries, that's what it means. So what do we do? Yesterday, for example, the Nigerian Bar Association had their elections electronically. I read it, and it was interesting. Somebody pointed it to my attention. The tool that was used was by some foreigners. It's an American tool.
So why are we not patronizing?
That's what I talk about. It's a game of framing. It's a game of framing. You asked about skill. We all went to the same schools as the Americans. And we know what our levels were in class. And they also know what our levels are. It is the name that you call your child that every other person is going to call that child. But as long as we continue to spin that, oh, Nigerians don't have... and I get to hear a lot of that. I'm the president of the institute. And we go have meetings and people tell us, oh, we don't think Nigeria has the capacity. Who says Nigeria doesn't have the capacity? Do we know how many projects are coming from foreign lands that are failing? The question is, if you really want to develop, you need to have a development mindset. And in development mindset, just like we spoke about when I talked about the startup ecosystem, there are possibilities of failure.
If you don't give them the necessary support.
So whether you give necessary support or not, there are possibilities of failure. It's experimentation, In performing experiments, you don't know the answer. If you knew the answer, you wouldn't call it an experiment. But without experiment, knowledge is never formed. If you talk about knowledge is about, you start by an informed position, an informed guess, which we call a hypothesis. Then you take it out to go and test. Sometimes your hypotheses stand, sometimes they don't stand. It's the same way with performing experiments. But what we are looking for a lot of times, and this is the challenge I see when I talk about the national strategy. So somebody comes, you see an RFP, and they're asking, oh, we want a company that has 25 years experience. That's okay. It sounds good. And so you disenfranchise every other person locally, you go look at it in a foreign land. What you are inadvertently doing is that in 25 years' time, you will still be looking for 25 years experience because you didn't allow anybody here. However, you need to have a development mindset. And you have to be very clear about it. In talking about development mindsets, there's a cost to it. But of course, there's also a reward to it. My guess, and what I know, is that nations that have development mindsets always win. And that's what I see as a challenge. The amount of money we spend. And I hear even some of my colleagues in the industry, they talk about domain experience. That's absolute nonsense. What's the meaning of domain experience? Don't we have bankers in Nigeria? Is banking in Nigeria different from the banking in America? Don't we have people who have worked in JP Morgan and all the firms that are back in Nigeria? Listen, I say this all the time. It is the name you call your child that every other person calls that child.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a need for us to press a reset button right now. Because actually, the pandemic is something that's a warning shot. I call it a warning shot. Take a look at what's going on today. Nobody can even travel. What that means is that should we have very severe challenges with some of our platforms that we depend on foreigners for, they cannot even come here to solve the problem. So we need to begin to think that we should be able to develop by ourselves, for ourselves.
So if we're talking about looking inwards, it should also be, IT should also be part of it.
It's something because it's so easy to do if we know what we are doing.
Okay, let's look at the issue of data protection. That again is one issue that is very critical in that industry. What do you think the country can actually do to deal with this issue and, of course, the sovereignty issue?
Of data. Yes, thank you. It still speaks to what we are talking about. So, NITDA, for example, talks about data protection, and we try to fight a number of these issues. But let me tell you the truth. First of all, knowing fully well what we know today, Data is very valuable. Data is, people call it the new oil. But the question is, the person that controls the platform controls the data. What platforms do we control in Nigeria? All of us, we use Facebook, we use Twitter, we use all sorts of platforms. Actually, you remember that even for national identity, at the time they were mooting the idea of giving it to MasterCard. So what you are inadvertently doing is you control nothing. Because let me tell you what happens. If you are not at the table for discussion, then you are on the table as menu. People are going to eat you up. And that's exactly what we are doing. We are actually creating and generating data and freely giving it out to foreigners. And until and unless the country begins to wake up. I mean, look, see other countries are doing it. China, for example. They have their own platforms. And all these models we're talking about are models we don't need to think too much. We just need to copy and adapt these issues. For us to talk about data sovereignty, to talk about data protection the way we want them, then we need to be in control of the platforms. Because he who owns the platforms controls what happens to it.
Okay. Now we're talking about creating jobs. As a president of the Institute of Software Practitioners, what is the impact of industry association, in making the industry create more jobs?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I've been president for 2 years. My tenure, I'm happy to say that my tenure should expire in the next 2 weeks or so. I'm looking forward to my successor. But to let you know that ISPON is 20 years old. And for 21 years old actually. I celebrated 20 years last year with the presidency. I want you to understand that the job of industrial association is to have people with similar interests. And what's our interest? The interests are what I've talked about. I insist, for example, that Nigeria is capable of developing by its own self. Nigeria does not need to borrow money. Actually, we borrow money in stupid kind. I use the word stupid kind. Because what you do, you say you are taking a sovereign loan from China or from another country. What for? The country then comes to offer services that our citizens could have offered. So what we are doing actually is exporting jobs and importing unemployment. So these are the things that ISPON has been doing for 20 years. First of all, we want to engage and ensure that some of these issues stop, or at least are controlled. And hold on, ISPON is not saying that we will not cooperate with other countries. No, we have to cooperate. But we insist that we want to cooperate as equals. We want to cooperate as respectable partners. You don't come to my backyard here and bring, I don't want to say inferior, but I say substandard solutions. Because a number of applications that come to Nigeria, I call them substandard. Not because they are not good, but because they were not developed for us. So it is when they come here that we actually start teaching them how to make it work for us. Why couldn't we have taught ourselves that? One of the things I've seen is that Nigerians and Nigeria seems to be a lot more patient with foreigners who come and peddle a lot of substandard things than their own brothers and sisters who have capabilities to come up with superior ideas. I may bold to say, I mean, you know that in the past few days, we've had lots of challenges, even on our electronic channels. You know, why are we having those challenges? Who are the solution providers? I am a solution provider in that field. And I can tell you clearly and boldly that our solution is very stable. Designed, implemented by Nigerians. Very respected. Yet, the issues are what do we talk about? So I'm saying that what ISPON will continue to do are these engagements. We will continue to bring up to the fore and to the face of both policymakers and the markets as well, what the possibilities are. Because our belief is that Nigeria has a great future only if we know how to organize a national strategy.
And I think that's a very good point to leave this conversation. Let's just hope we eventually get it right, make things happen here for us, by us, basically. Thank you very much, Dr. Okeremi, for coming on the show.
Pleasure's mine.
Yele Okeremi is the president of the Institute of Software Practitioners of Nigeria. After the break, we'll look at half-year results of cement companies released so far. To stay with us. An earnings season is in full gear at the equities market, with a number of them already churned out their half-year results, while some posted dismal figures reflective of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Others, particularly those from the cement sector, managed to post firm results irrespective of those effects of the pandemic. In our next conversation, we will be looking at the results of the two cement giants, Dangote Cement and Lafarge Wapco. And joining us now to analyze these results is the head of portfolio management at Comercio Partners Asset Management, Victor Aluyi. Good morning, Victor. Thank you for joining us.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with Dangote Cement. Are you surprised at the year-on-year growth in revenue and the other key lines, despite the COVID-19 lockdown, that saw the restrictions on movement across markets in Africa?
No, I'm not surprised. I think it's a result that I would describe as largely resilient in spite of the COVID-19 challenge. For context, group revenue rose by just 2% to about 476 billion. However, if you dimension that result, you would see that the Nigerian arm of the business essentially constituted, the major drag. Revenue in Nigeria was up by just 1.2% to 332 billion, while Pan-African revenue, that's revenue from its other African, businesses, rose by about 3.5% to 145 billion. It's also important to point out here that, revenue from Nigeria accounts for about 61% of total group revenue, while revenue from its Pan-African business, that's its other African businesses, accounts for about 39% of total group revenue. It's also important to mention here that Dangote Cement has African subsidiaries across about 9 African countries. So it has a really strong Pan-African footing. If you also look at volume growth, which also directly speaks to, the sort of revenue growth that we have seen, volume growth across the group declined by about 1.5% to about 12.1 million metric tons. If you look at the volumes for Nigeria, that dropped by about 2.4% to 7.4 million metric tons. Pan-African volumes grew slightly, 0.7% to about 4.7 million metric tons. In terms of volume growth, again, Nigeria accounts for about 69% of that, while the Pan-African business accounts for about 31%. So across board, you're seeing very resilient results. As a matter of fact, you're seeing significant traction on that Pan-African front, whilst, of course, Nigeria was the major drag, if you will. And that's quite understandable, because of the COVID-19 challenge. And also the half year, which is typically heralded by the rainy season, is typically a slow period for the cement manufacturers as well. But all in all, I think the results is quite resilient.
Now, but what do you think the company may have done differently to record such success that second quarter?
Well, I think that it's market share, it's dominant presence in other African countries, because like I pointed out, if it was not for the growth that we saw coming through from its Pan-African business, in spite of the fact that it just contributes about 30% to the group number, it was able to pretty much assuage the impact of the drag that we saw in Nigeria. Remember that Nigeria was on substantial lockdown, movements was restricted, so that clearly reflects the fact that, the growth that is seen on that Pan-African front is helping to really assuage, that impact on the Nigerian front.
Now, part of the drags for the company is the general increase in salaries, which also pushed the Nigerian manufacturing costs upwards relative to half-year 2019. Materials consumed, for example, increased by about 6% year-on-year. And what do you make of such development?
Well, I mean, it's reflective of the times, really. These are costs that, they have to sort of bear with every now and then. But I think I would look to the sort of growth that we're seeing, in that top line. I would also look to the sort of expansion we're seeing in that Pan-African business. It's also important to look at, some of the dynamics within its balance sheet and see how, the business continues to move and continues to grow going forward. If you look at the EBITDA for Danksem, that came in flat at about 218 billion. But again, if you further dimension, you will see that EBITDA from Nigeria was down about 3.1%, while the EBITDA from the Pan-African business grew about 31%. So I think that, that Pan-African business seems to be a bright spot, if you will. But it's also important to know that we're going to see some significant recovery on that Nigerian front as lockdowns have been eased, as we have seen movements, interstate movement that have been also eased. That should significantly ramp up volume for the Nigerian business. So I think that, the second half of the business should even be much better than what we have seen from that challenged first half.
How optimistic are you, about the commencement of the Apapa and One export terminals? Do you see such moves helping to mitigate the impacts of the land border closure in the second half of the year?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the strategy. The land border closure has been a drag, really, particularly for its, West African business. Nigeria has deposits of really good limestone, which you don't have in other West African countries. So it forms a major hub through which quality cements can be pushed out into the rest of West Africa. But unfortunately, the land border closure has been a major restriction on that. So the opening of the Apapa export terminal and also the One port as well would significantly improve that situation. As a matter of fact, that export has already started. About 26,000 tons of clinker was exported over the last couple of months. And we would see that also ramp up quite significantly towards the end of the year. So yes, that's a very, very positive development for Dangote Cements.
All right, let's look at Lafarge Wapco. Do you get any sense of resilience in the second quarter results, given the earnings before interest and taxes growth of about 29.7% compared to the previous year?
I think for Lafarge, the sort of growth that we've seen in revenue is quite encouraging, about 2.3%, which is also largely in line with what we're seeing for Dangote Cement. But I think the story for Lafarge is essentially around its the deleveraging of its balance sheets and also the hiving off of the South African business. That has significantly optimized and improved the balance sheet position of the business, its financial position as well. So we see revenue increasing by about 2.3% to 120 billion. However, if you look at that on a quarter-on-quarter, that's in quarter two, for instance, revenue was down by about 5.1%. Again, that essentially points to the whole COVID-19 challenge around the restriction of movements. Like I said earlier, the beginning of Q2 usually heralds the rainy season, which is typically a slow period for cement manufacturers. We've seen margin expansion, we've seen finance costs drop quite significantly, and that has also boosted bottom line for Lafarge. For context, what they have in terms of half year profit after tax about 28 billion is higher than the entire profit that they got for last year. So clearly you are seeing significant improvement for Lafarge. You are seeing resilient growth in top line, but I think that balance sheet deleveraging will prove very, very critical in ensuring that they are able to sustain this sort of performance going forward.
Now, what do you make of the fall in net sales of Lafarge by about minus 5.1%?
Well, I think, like I said, it's clearly reflective of, the seasonality and also equally importantly, the whole COVID-19 challenge. We had significant interstate lockdown for about a month plus. Movement was restricted. So it obviously affected its, route to market. But as that has been eased now, it should, significantly improve, going forward. So I think that's a one-off, reduction that we're seeing. Going into the rest of the year, I think we're going to see significant improvement on that front.
Our Lafarge Africa seems to have a relatively low finance costs in the second quarter compared to the corresponding quarter in 2019. How will you score the management in this regard, considering the 67% year-on-year drop this period and the fact that all through 2019, finance costs kept growing quarterly from about an 8.32 billion naira in first quarter of 2019 to 20.18 billion naira in the fourth quarter.
So, like I said, so the story for Lafarge really has been that balance sheet deleveraging. They've had very significant challenges, particularly with respect to finance costs. What they have done basically is to sell off the South African business and also significantly reduce the debt on their balance sheets. And that is beginning to show. The reason you saw those significant increase in finance costs through 2019 was, the challenge was still there and they were essentially trying to deal with it. But you're beginning to see the result of the fact that they have dealt with that and you're seeing finance costs drop significantly. We expect that to actually continue because that would obviously give the company, significant leeway to continue to improve its bottom line because that finance cost element is almost essentially out of the picture, really.
Now, Nigeria's cement consumption in the second quarter turned out better than expected despite the low volumes recorded in sales. But would you say the decline in volume is as a result of the growing competition within the cement industry or due to the lockdown effects?
I think it's a combination of factors, but I would say that, the lockdown effect is quite significant. It's a significant portion of that. There are essentially three major cement producers in Nigeria today, and they all have their, if you will, niche market, and they're all doing well in those various markets. So the sort of results that we're seeing for Lafarge and also Danksem is clearly reflective of what's going on in the industry in terms of the COVID-19 challenge, as well as, the slowdown, the seasonality in terms of slowing down, particularly during the rainy season. So I think it's a combination of factors, really.
Now, the government's capital projects for the second half of the year are in the works, and one would literally expect Lafarge to benefit from this. But how healthy is the competition among the dominant players? We have Dangote, we have Bua, and of course Lafarge, in the space, given these projects' demands.
Well, I think Danksem is by far the biggest player, and of course they are poised to obviously benefit the most. But I think that with the capital expenditure being executed by government, most certainly all of the cement players would benefit. But also it's important to point out the fact that you have a lot of real estate projects going on, particularly in the southwest, where you have Lafarge having a really strong presence. But again, I think that their market share would play a key role. So obviously Dangote Cement would be the biggest winner. For a player like Bua Cement, we're seeing capacity increase quite rapidly over the last year plus. That would also put them in a good position to adequately compete. So obviously with these three players, that could also be good for the final consumer. But again, because of the deficit that we're seeing in infrastructure, the demand really remains really strong and resilient. So clearly, these players are poised to benefit quite significantly from that capital expenditure implementation of the federal government.
So generally, what is your outlook for that sector?
Well, I mean, going into the rest of the year, I think we're going to see a better performance. I believe that the worst of the COVID-19 challenge is behind us. I also believe that towards the end of Q3, going into Q4, the seasonal impact of the rainy season will start to reduce. So we should see, a decent pickup in volume. So for I believe that the second half of the year will be much better than the first half on the back of the fact that the worst of the COVID-19 challenge is behind us, and also the seasonality impact would have significantly reduced. So I believe that going forward into the rest of the year, we're likely to see even better performance for Danksem. We're likely to see even improved performance on the Pan-African front. For Lafarge, the balance sheet deleveraging will continue to, provide great succor for that bottom line. And for Bua, I think that the increase in its capacity and also the ramping up of its capacity utilization will continue to bode well for it. So I think we'll see a better second half than the first half that we have seen.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Victor. Victor Aluyi is the head of portfolio management at Comercio Partners Asset Management. Well, in the meantime, the former central bank governor Lamido Sanusi has thrown its weight behind the central bank's recent moves to unify the Nigerian exchange rate, saying it is the way to go. Mr. Sanusi was speaking at a webinar tagged the United States of Naira, at what price for unification, organized by New Markets Media and Intelligence in London. According to him, it is time for Nigeria to learn from its past mistakes and fast-track initiatives that will bring about long-term development.
Going back to 2015, 2016, I was extremely critical of the multiple exchange rate position of the central bank. I was critical of fiscalization of government deficits. In fact, I suppose 80% of the problems I've had with the government have had to do with my being critical of the policy has been running. So I'm in a strange position today where I am actually defending and endorsing what's happening precisely because this is what we have been saying should happen. Okay, we cannot continue always we don't criticize for the sake of criticism. So the government has said we no longer pay fuel subsidies. That's one thing done. We're going to look at VAT. That's one thing done. We're going to look at electricity tariffs. That's one thing done. We're moving to unified exchange rates. So it's a whole series of things happening that are moving the economy in the right direction. Now, secondly, we also need to look at the numbers. Okay, so if you take the current account balance and trade account balance, yes, they're in deficit. But look at where it was at Q4 2019 and Q1 2020, and you find that the deficit is actually reducing. Okay, so it's important to say we are in a bad place. But as far as Forex is concerned, the central bank probably has a sense that if we can continue in this direction, we will be moving from both directions. So yes, you're devaluing, but you're also able to increase the funding of the market. Okay, and that reduces the amount by which the naira will fall to avoid what Fejiro was saying about the very high rates of inflation and the adverse consequences of a massive devaluation of the currency, or even fluctuation as prices go up and down. So look at the current account balance, look at the trade balance, and you find that Q1 2021 is better than Q4 2020. And look at what OPEC is doing. Okay, look at what the other domestic policy, and you think that there is progress. Now, what should the central bank do? I think is like all of us, is to look back over the last 3-4 years and say, where did I go wrong? Okay, there are certainly decisions that would have been taken by both Ministry of Finance and central bank in 2015 and 2016 that would have placed us in a better position today than we are. If you look at, and actually when you consider what you call the pre-existing conditions, in 2015 when the crisis hit, 2014, the economy was growing about 6%. But when this crisis hit, we were growing at 2%. Okay, we haven't done enough on the power sector. We haven't done enough. We didn't move out of subsidies quickly enough. We didn't reduce government overheads quickly enough. We didn't start introducing transparency in NMPC quickly enough. It's time to just fast track all of those things, take advantage of the learning points of the crisis and lay the foundation for long-term structural adjustment and development. So I think just being honest and saying we may have made some bad calls in the past. Okay, now we forced to make the right calls. Let us continue in this direction. That's what I would expect the central bank and the Ministry of Finance and everybody to do. And then for all of us to encourage them to continue in that direction and also understand the challenges they're facing. I would certainly discourage the central bank from even trying to just get an appreciation of the currency. Even maintaining the fixed nominal rate in the face of rising inflation has stopped us from having a real effective exchange rate depreciation, which we need in order to be competitive. So the idea that the central bank should be interested in getting back to 360 it's not. I mean, if we've gone beyond that, we've gone beyond that. If we're able to bring down inflation, if we're able to have structural changes, then that's fine. But with the structure of the economy as it is, the obsession with a strong nominal value of the currency hurts the real economy. And this is really what we need to get. I mean, there's always a trade-off. You can protect the portfolio investors and give them the dollars they want at a fixed exchange rate. But what is the cost? What is the cost to reserves? What is the cost to inflation? What is the cost to the amount of currency that's actually going into real production? So these economic trade-offs are there. And I think having a weaker currency in order to trade off for economic growth is something that central banks should go for.
I was Lamido Sanusi, former Central Bank Governor. Well, we'll do an opening call to London as well as the week's review of the markets here after the break. To stay with us. Okay, let's get updates from the street of London with Juliana. Hello, Juliana. Good morning. Well, Sky is the latest to report another plunge in revenue. Now, the broadcaster is reporting £575 million plunge in revenues. What are the contributory factors to this result?
Good morning, Chimeze. Well, the British network is owned by the American company Comcast, and they did their earnings update, and they're down. Their profits are down 15.5% from 4.8 billion to just 4 billion. And it seems to be just one reason that's the cause of this, and it's football, sport. As soon as sport stopped playing on football, should I say, stopped playing in March because of the lockdown, and we're talking about the Premier League, the Bundesliga and Serie A, people stopped subscribing. They decided that it wasn't worth keeping their subscriptions. So during that quarter, they lost, Sky lost about 300,000 subscribers. These are sports subscribers, and they are starting to see a pickup. But we know that a lot of the places that football gets their revenue is from these big contracts, and that period of time has really been dented clearly by the results that they posted earlier today.
And we talked about Lloyds Banking Group's results yesterday, and now the bank says it's reviewing the amount of office space it uses, becoming the latest large UK employer to take advantage of a home working trend during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this is in spite of the government's push to get workers back into offices in August. Do you see more companies defying Boris Johnson's planned return to work?
In short, Chimeze, yes, I do see a lot of people defining this, a lot of corporate giants. Lloyds aren't the first, and they're certainly not going to be the last. We've already heard about Google. Google said that they don't expect their staff to go back to work until the middle of next year, and we are seeing a lot of other big corporate giants doing that. On August the 1st, which is tomorrow, there is going to be a change in the tone of the British government. Before, people, of course, were told to stay at home. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, then changed that and said, if you can't work from home, you should go to work. Now he's putting the power in the hand of the employer and asking them to start telling their employees to start coming to work, even if you can work from home. But the issue is, you know, Brits for the past couple of months have been quite comfortable working from their kitchens, their bedrooms, and their living rooms, and some people still don't think it's safe. Also, this work home culture has been discussed a lot of in Europe over the past couple of years. A lot of parties have been asking governments to consider maybe a 4-day working week, less working time in the office. There have been issues with mental health problems, and so people have been really comfortable working from home. The issue that this government has is that the economy does rely on people being out. I've discussed this with you before, Chimeze, that especially in London, people buy coffees in the morning, they have lunch outside, and of course they can buy clothes on the way home. If they're not in the office, then they cannot do this. And Boris Johnson knows that he cannot afford this. So the rules do change tomorrow. But like I said, we have seen it from a lot of other corporate giants beside Lloyds. Are they going to tell people to work from home when actually the culture works perfectly for them?
All right, we'll see how that plays out from tomorrow. Anyway, separate households have been banned from meeting each other indoors in parts of northern England following a spike in coronavirus cases. But Labour has criticized the government for a lack of clarity over the measures and for announcing them late at night. Do we have more details on these new restriction moves?
Well, yes and no, Chimeze, but I've got to tell you, this is a major story. This lockdown affects 4.5 million people on the day where millions of Muslims around the world and in Nigeria are celebrating Eid. Greater Manchester, the northwest and the north of London is home to millions of Muslims, and this announcement has caught people completely out of surprise. The communication has been described as being atrocious. It was tweeted late last night, 9 o'clock in the evening. Matt Hancock, the health secretary, said that there has to be a lockdown, that it's now illegal for people within the Greater Manchester, and there are other regions, to meet with anybody outside of their family. be it in their home, be it in their gardens. The problem is there are so many mixed messagings. They're saying you still can go to a pub, you can still go to a restaurant. So what is it you can and cannot do? This has caused a lot of outrage. As you said, the Labour opposition party, led by Sir Keir Starmer, has said that he's absolutely furious at this, that this last minute communique that Matt Hancock put out on Twitter is just totally unacceptable. Again, Eid is a massive celebration. There are so many families that were planning to get together, and now that has been restricted. So the information is still coming out, and it's not just the rate of infection that's actually surged in the north and the northwest. We're hearing that in the southeast, so just outside of London, the rate of infection is also increasing. The Prime Minister, he's currently on holiday here in Britain. He has said that there will be more local lockdowns. They're already concerned about a second wave creeping through the north of Europe. Some holiday destinations are already been put on a blacklist. We're expecting more. So it's a little bit chaotic here in the UK at the moment in terms of the communication and where the surges are happening. But the government have said they're doing their best to protect the lives of citizens, and they do not want to see a repeat of what they've seen in the last couple of weeks. But I've got to tell you, it's a major story, and it affects 4.5 million people in England.
And a serious one at that. Anyway, thank you, Juliana. We expect update from you later in the day.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a short but interesting trading week, and Eddie John Ewan is here to wrap up the week for us. Eddie.
Good morning, Chime. You're right. It's been a brief trading week as the market opened for just 3 days due to the Eid holidays. And just like you said, although it was short, it was interesting. As the all-share index rose by 1.09% to 24,693.73 points, and the equity cap was higher at 12.882 trillion naira, a total turnover of 421.98 million shares worth 5.33 billion naira were traded in 11,801 deals. The financial services industry, measured by volume, led the activity chart with 249.55 million shares valued at 1.56 billion naira, and that contributed about 59% and 29% to the total equity turnover, volume, and value, respectively. The sectors were mixed this week, although the broad market performance was supported by names in the industrial goods and banking counters as both topped the performance chart. As you can see, the banking and industrial goods counter rose the most. Banking was up 3.03%. Industrial goods was up 3.63%. Consumer goods declined. Oil and gas shaved off 6.51%, while insurance was unchanged. Investors are advised to trade cautiously and seek trading opportunities in only fundamentally justified stocks. Now, at the fixed income market, the Treasury bond market continued to trade with bullish sentiment this week as the healthy liquidity in the system, boosted investors' confidence, and investors reinvested coupon payments. However, on Wednesday, the bond market reversed its bullish trend and ended the last trading day of the week negative as the yields rose by 7 basis points. In all, yields declined by 20 basis points on average week on week. On Wednesday, we saw 60 deals worth 50.01 billion naira. The Nigerian Treasury bills market was really quiet this week as investors focused on the primary market auction on Wednesday. Now, Wednesday was the only day we saw activity on that counter, and there were just 2 deals worth 180.0 million naira. Trading in the automobiles markets was bullish on the back of buoyant system liquidity. The average yield across all instruments contracted by 41 basis points. On Wednesday, which was the last trading day of the week, we saw 33 deals worth 134.76 billion naira. Well, we hope we have a positive trading week next week. At least, we've seen these good sentiments, and we hope that they spill into next week's trading session. But that's it on the market wrap-up. Over to you, Chimi.
Hopefully, and we'll continue to keep the hopes high there. Thank you very much, Eddie. And well, that's it on the program. It's a holiday here, and of course, we wish our Muslim friends happy Eid. Thank you from all of us here. I'm Chimizi Iwago.